Welcome everybody who's managed to hook in. Hope you're all faring well wherever you are across the country. I'd like to acknowledge traditional owners of the whole land on which we all come. Traditional owners past, present, emerging, their contribution to the land, the culture, the history. I'd like to acknowledge Heather and Anthony Benny from the department, and thank you both for coming in. Heather's the Director of Environmental Markets, and Heather will be the one providing the briefing, the presentation today. The level of interest into the biodiversity market legislation that's being proposed next month is huge. And it does bring a lot of, I guess, risk, challenge, opportunity. So I think it'll be fantastic to hear from Heather herself today. Now, Heather's very kindly agreed to share the presentation as a PDF following this, so that can be shared amongst you all. And please also put your questions in the chat. Kate and Mark are going to be working behind the scenes with questions, so don't feel it's too premature, even though the presentation hasn't finished. Put your questions in, and then Kate and Mark can work on those. So I guess, again, if you've just joined, if you can just make sure you're muted, that would be fantastic. Alrighty, Heather, I'll pass over to you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for giving us some time to come and talk to you today about the legislation that's been introduced into the Parliament. I think some of you may have been involved in some consultation work that went on late last year on the proposed framework for the legislation. And today we just wanted to run you through where that's sort of landed and what some of the next steps are following passage of the legislation. I'll kind of do the presentation. I think we've sort of agreed we'll deal with questions at the end, but I'll leave it to Kate and Mark to work out if you should sort of interrupt me at some point that'll be fine. Okay, so you would all be well aware that there's a growing interest in market-based approaches to achieving environmental outcomes in a way that also provides financial incentives for those who are supplying the outcomes. The government's been running the Agricultural Biodiversity Stewardship package for a while now, which has been designing and testing approaches for describing and valuing biodiversity outcomes, and also looking at some of the pricing incentives that are needed for people to participate in that type of a market. It's shown that there's potential for a national voluntary market. Farmers are willing to supply, and there are organisations that are interested in buying, but there's underpinnings that are needed for that to really emerge at a national scale. And that includes consistent ways to describe and verify the biodiversity outcomes, a clear property right for buyers so that they're confident about their ability to sort of own and use that outcome, and then also a good level of assurance around delivery of the product to the buyer. So those are the type of issues that this legislation is trying to address. There it is in all its black and white glory, the Agriculture Biodiversity Stewardship Market Act. It's a framework legislation, which means that the key elements are set out in the bill, and then there's provision for subordinate legislation, which will be where a lot of the operational detail is worked through. And if you have the joy of having a read over the bill, which is available on the Parliament House website, you'll see that there's references throughout it to rules and also to protocol determinations, and that's subordinate legislation. Importantly, subordinate legislation is still subject to parliamentary scrutiny and disallowance. These are the key elements of the bill. I'm just going to run you through each of them in the presentation. So we've got the Biodiversity Project, we've got protocol determinations, we've got the idea of a biodiversity certificate. There's obligations that the legislation imposes on proponents, and then also compliance tools which help support implementation. Okay, so all right, this is about the Biodiversity Project, which, as you can see, is a project that enhances or protects biodiversity in native species. So the bill provides for an eligible person to apply to register a biodiversity project on eligible land. So there's some tests there you can see for the project and for the land and the person, sorry. So the applicant needs to satisfy a fit and proper person test, and the project needs to be covered by a protocol determination, which I'll talk about in a second. And then the project needs to be carried out on certain kinds of lands. And that's eligible lands, which is defined in the legislation. So that's defined as agricultural land within Australia, or as otherwise described by the rules. The intention is that agricultural land will be broadly defined. So there's some examples you can see on the slide there. Obviously, it's what would be generally understood to be agricultural land, for example, grazing, cropping, or other agricultural enterprises, but also pastoral and leasehold land, and also obviously remnant vegetation that might be on agricultural land, even though in a technical land classification sense that might not be agricultural land. So there's some detail to be worked through there, but the intention is that it's a broad definition. So the next key aspect of the legislation is the protocol determination. So protocol determinations are similar to carbon methodologies under the carbon market scheme. They apply to a type of biodiversity project, for example, projects that enhance remnant vegetation. And they'll set out how the project is to be carried out. For example, activities to be undertaken during the active management period, any minimum permanence requirements that might be set in relation to that type of project, and also the point during the life of a project at which a biodiversity certificate could be issued, which I'll also talk about in a sec. So protocol determinations are legislative instruments. They're made by the Agriculture Minister. The process for making the protocol determination is set out in the legislation, and it includes a requirement for public consultation. In addition, in making the determination, there's some things that the Minister must have regard to, and that includes the biodiversity integrity standards, which are in section 57 of the bill, which relate to integrity around the outcomes of projects conducted in line with that protocol determination, and also regard to the advice from the Expert Advisory Committee. Next is the Biodiversity Certificate. So the Biodiversity Certificate is issued at an appropriate point, so the proponent can apply for the certificate to be issued. The certificate represents the outcome that is expected to be delivered by a project, and the bill clarifies that it's personal property, which means that the buyer can have a lot of confidence around their ownership and their use of that property. The ownership of the certificate will be reflected in a public register. So you have the information about the project in the register, you have information about the certificate associated with that project and who owns it. The bill then sets out a bunch of obligations that exist for all project proponents. That includes complying with the protocol determination. There's a requirement to submit biodiversity project reports at certain points during the life of the project, a requirement to notify the regulator if certain things occur, and also requirements to keep records and undertake monitoring in line with the protocol determination. And these obligations then link through to the compliance provisions that are in the legislation. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but essentially there's a sort of a pyramid of compliance provisions that are available to the regulator to use in certain sets of circumstances. So this is how it looks at a very simplified sort of project level. It might be easy to see how it flows in this kind of a format. So what you don't see on the slide here is the first step, which is that the protocol determination gets made by the Minister. So once the determination is available, the proponent goes away and develops their individual project and applies for it to be registered. If they meet the tests that are set out in the legislation, their project is registered and is listed on the public register. They then get on with implementing it at the appropriate point along the life of the project. They apply to have their certificate issued. If they meet the tests, the certificate's issued and its ownership sits with the proponent at that point in time. The purple bits you can see on the slide here kind of exist outside the legislation, and that's the commercial negotiation and agreements that go on between the proponent and a buyer. Once those are settled, and the certificate is sold, the ownership is transferred in the register to the new owner. Meanwhile, the farmer's getting on with implementing their project in line with the protocol determination and what they've set in terms of activity and permanence periods. They submit biodiversity reports as they're required to, and at the end of the permanence period, the project ends. And at that point, the farmer can decide to just finish the project, or they could potentially re-enter the market with something similar or even something different. For example, if they've restored vegetation to the point that it might then be eligible for a different type of project. So that's sort of how it looks in a kind of simple way in terms of some of the key steps for a project. So this slide here shows you some of the governance arrangements that are set out in the legislation. So the first is the Agriculture Minister, who is the minister responsible for the legislation. They appoint the advisory committee and make the protocol determinations. The advisory committee is established by the legislation. The legislation sets out requirements for membership, skills, and term of appointment. The functions of the committee are also listed in the legislation. That really kind of revolves around the protocol determinations, advising the minister on the making of determinations, but also monitoring and reviewing them to make sure that they remain relevant and in line with the integrity requirements. The Clean Energy Regulator undertakes key regulatory functions, for example, registering projects, issuing certificates, and also administering the should they need to be used. Finally, there's a function for the Agriculture Secretary, which is set out in Part 6 of the bill, which provides the Secretary with the authority to enter into contracts on behalf of the Commonwealth, should the Commonwealth decide at some point it wanted to enter the market as a buyer to achieve policy objectives. As I said, the legislation is currently in the Parliament. The Minister is aiming for it to be passed as quickly as possible. And once that happens, we then have to get on with implementation. So in the legislation, it says that the bill commences on royal assent, with the provisions that relate to the registration of projects to start on a declaration from the Minister. And that kind of means the legislation comes into effect, and then there's a period of time when there's a bunch of work that needs to go on before we'd be in a position to accept project applications. So I've got a couple of the key points here. It's hard to kind of summarise it in a couple of dot points, but one of the first things will be the appointment of the advisory committee, which I talked about earlier. And then they'll be working on the biodiversity protocols, which are obviously needed before you can start submitting projects for registration. We also need to establish a method for assessing biodiversity benefit associated with projects. So that will be presented as a set of information or a score in relation to projects on the register. And we'll be looking at things like what's the condition gain associated with a project for the vegetation or habitat, but also what does that project mean in a regional or a landscape context. So that'll be a very interesting and challenging bit of work, and we're going to really need to build on a lot of existing expertise and evidence, including the work that's been going on under the stewardship package. At the same time, we need to get on with the other subordinate legislation that's set out in the legislation that's needed for the scheme to operate. And we'll need to be working with the regulator so that they're ready to start accepting projects for registration once those provisions kick in. That's going to be really meaty stuff and quite challenging over the coming months after the legislation passes. So the legislation itself and the work that's directly referenced in there is just kind of one part of the picture. There's a bunch of other things that need to happen to allow the market to really operate effectively. And one of the key areas is around building advisory capacity. So this might be a role that NRM organisations would be interested in. And there's going to need to be advice to farmers in relation to things like what do they have on their farm? How might you design a project so that it links, so that it maximises the value or outcomes that it could deliver? And then also, what are the links with other programs, for example, the carbon market, and how might people think about projects that are delivering products into both markets? It's also going to need to be work about how the benefit assessment works and the links between regional priorities and the assessment process that needs to be designed there. Some other areas of work are shown on this slide. For example, we're going to be looking at model contracts that would be available to participants in the market. Now, this isn't mandatory, but we think it would be really useful to reduce transaction costs, but also guide commercial discussions that might help address what could be power. We're also looking at some guidelines for the market, particularly on the buyer side, to help them understand what they could reasonably say about what they've contributed to a project via the purchase of the certificate. For example, if there are two buyers, what can they respectively say about how they've contributed to a project? And then finally, what looks like a sort of a smallish block on this slide is really a massive area of work, which is about the trading platform that's been developed under the stewardship package, which is building connections between farmers and buyers to help line up the supply and the demand side of the market. So that's sort of a short slide, but it's a huge amount of work and is something that we're going to really need to think through to help the market operate effectively. And I think that was where I was going to wrap up. I'm happy to talk further about any of those particular aspects or other issues, questions you might have. Thanks.
Heather, thank you so much. We do have some questions. Thank you for the thorough presentation. I guess one of the first questions that has popped into the chat box is the role for regional NRM organisations in the process. So if you could provide a little clarity around sort of your department and the minister's attitude towards that, and how much of a direct transaction relationship it is between the landholder and the department.
I can jump in if you like. So Anthony, Benny, I think I know a number of you around the traps from our Ag Stewardship package. Really good question about the role of NRM bodies. And I think one of the really successful experiences that we've had from the agricultural stewardship pilots is the strong relationship we've had with the local NRM bodies, and utilising and building on that local interaction that the NRM bodies have with farmers on the ground. That's been, I think, a really successful relationship, which I think I saw Nick's on the line. I'm sure he's mentioned aspects of this through our relationship with Burnett Mary as an example. We'll be really looking to see how we can utilise NRM bodies in a similar way should this legislation be passed. That local interaction is not something that we have at Canberra, that's for sure. NRM groups have phenomenal expertise in their local areas. That will require, I think, as this market develops, will require a lot of engagement with landholders to provide some of that advice and understanding of what these markets may provide to them, but also the growing opportunities in the carbon space as well. That is, I think, continuing to grow. So I think that's, should this legislation be passed, we're going to have more engagement and connections with NRM groups around how that starts getting rolled out.
Thanks, Anthony, and thanks for jumping in. So another question would be the certificate approach. So Heather touched on the certificate approach as opposed to the ACCU approach, which is used for carbon credits. So why is the certificate approach being used for biodiversity markets?
Heather, did you want to take this one?
Yep, sure. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, my reception is really shocking at the moment, but yeah, I guess there's a number of reasons why the certificate approach has been taken rather than the credit approach. One is that the crediting approach requires you to set up front at a scheme level how you're going to weight and value different attributes associated with a project. So, for example, how important is a project in the north of Australia versus southern Australia, or a re-veg versus a restoration project, and how do those compare? One gets 10 and one gets 20 units, and that's a very big step to take, and requires a set of methodologies and decisions that in this sort of early stage of the market seemed sort of preemptive. The other issue is that the reasons that people invest in these projects are quite different, and that often you have to look below the credit level to really understand that, or to be able to purchase on the basis of that. So, for example, something might have a certain number of credits, but if you're interested in investing in a certain species, then you don't have that information in the credits. So rather than taking the crediting approach, what we have settled on is a certificate approach, where each project is described against a standard set of attributes, so that it does allow comparison across the market, but doesn't involve the Commonwealth saying that this project is worth more than that project.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So the advisory committee, has your department thought about what organisations or sectors would be represented on the advisory committee for this? Anthony or Heather?
So that's, I think, as Heather noted in the presentation, that'll be one of the first things that we'll have to get established, the advisory committee, and that'll be a ministerial appointment of those members. So really all we could say is what's comprised in the legislation. So that's consists of 4 to 6 members. In terms of their expertise, we've suggested that, or the legislation indicates that it be expertise across agriculture, biological, ecological science, and environmental markets. So that's reasonably broad, but we do need, I think, obviously that committee is an important aspect of the development of this market, and it will require good, strong expertise across a range of things. So I think I have touched base with Kate previously about potential people in that space that would be representative, but we haven't at this stage put any names on paper about who they would be or what have you. Minister at the moment is focused on the legislation getting passed, and then considering who would be represented on that group. But getting that body represented correctly, both in terms of agriculture, both in terms of ecological expertise and how markets will operate, will be the challenge. But obviously the key role of that group will be ensure integrity into the market and getting the protocols and what have you that are developed meeting the various requirements. So yes, it'll be an important group, and getting that representation right would be essential.
I agree. Thank you, Anthony. IPAs, Indigenous Protected Areas, there's a question there asking if they'll be eligible for the programme.
So the market, or the legislation currently limits it to agricultural land. This is a piece of legislation coming from the Minister for Agriculture. That said, if Indigenous people are operating agricultural practices as part of that land, then they would certainly be eligible. But the legislation currently limits it to agricultural land. Should they broaden that out at some stage in the future, would be a decision for government. But currently the legislation is limited to ag lands. And what we've done, what the government has done in terms of the legislation, the specific definition of ag lands and how that would be developed would be defined in the rules. So that would be something that we'll have to work through on as part of that implementation process.
Okay, thank you. Where will the relevant data sit, and how is it contextualised into the landscape, i.e. regional NRM planning? And I know this is something that Kate and I have talked about plenty of times. This sounds like a question from Kate, is it? Or someone's been worded up to us the same question. But regional NRM plans, I think, provide a real opportunity in terms of this landscape-based approach and identifying where there's value in the landscape from undertaking different practices. I think that it is also the certificate-based approach where you can define various attributes. Again, we'll be able to demonstrate how it potentially is linked in with regional NRM plans. These will be issues that we'll have to work through as part of the implementation process, but getting better understanding of where these kind of things could
be undertaken in the landscape to achieve broader outcomes will be sort of an essential component that we'll have to consider as part of the design implementation. And I think it'll be something that the advisory group will probably want to take into account, or have at least consider the approaches to regional NRM plans. I think one, I suppose, question to the group here, how consistent are regional NRM plans across the country? I know I'm not completely across all the detail in local NRM plans, but to what degree they are consistent across the country in terms of their approach and design. When I think the national market will dive into the space, they're always after consistency. So the more you can make those plans, at least the format and the approach and the issues considered, I think would be useful in terms of that market approach.
Noted, thank you. So where are the current skill gaps for NRM organisations to help grow the market and opportunities for landholders in the short term? And have you explored with Eco Markets Australia the potential to use their trading platform rather than setting up a new system?
So I think this is going to be a bit of a work in progress, and I think there's a lot of learnings to be had from the carbon market. I think this is going to be quite a large cultural shift in terms of broadening out opportunities from environmental markets for both the landholders, but also local NRM bodies and others in the marketplace that are potentially purchasing these certificates, to understand what it is that they're buying and how they work their way through the system. So there will be, I think, as part of the implementation process, and Heather touched on this, the need to both develop the expertise and capabilities at the farm scale or at the landholder scale, but also the various advisory groups or NRM groups that are on the ground providing some of that advice and support. So I don't want to call out any in particular sort of capability gap. When you talk about a whole new market, there's obviously a gap. So there's going to be need to lift that up as we, I think, go forward. And I think I suppose the experience through the recent ag stewardship pilots, working with the NRM groups, I think that's been a really useful exercise for all involved to sort of lift the capability in terms of carbon markets and the opportunities there. So a similar uplift, I think, across all the NRM regions, I think would certainly be of benefit to landholders as we go forward. And there was a question on the trading platform. So yes, we've been working very closely with the ANU around the development of the trading platform, which is more than just a trading platform. It's predominantly a planning tool to farmers to better understand the assets that they hold. So it does provide this opportunity for landholders to estimate potential carbon potential on their land, but also environmental assets to potentially participate in these kind of future markets. But yes, there is, I think, as soon as you use the word platform, there seems to be a plethora of platforms being developed these days. And it doesn't need to be one platform to rule them all, but certainly we've been using our platform to provide that planning tool and support to farmers, and that potential linkage of the buyers and the sellers. So trying to sort of cover all bases, but that's the decision that I suppose the Minister made, is to develop that additional platform to meet those needs.
Great, thank you. We had a question around IPAs, but what about Aboriginal owned freehold land? So an example over in the Northern Territory, there's some former pastoral leases. They've been converted to Aboriginal freehold. Where do they sit?
And this is I think the complexities that you start getting into when you start to define lands, which is why why the legislation allows this to be worked through in the rules, because the intent is to be as incorporate as much as possible under the auspices of agricultural lands, and they may have changed over time in that the ownership of it may have been converted to, whether it's to Indigenous or other conservation practices, but ultimately it was agricultural lands previously. So these are the details that we'll have to work through as part of that implementation aspect, to ensure that we're keeping that as broad as we can within the legislation rules, to provide those broader benefits to landholders.
Yeah, sounds good. Will biodiversity outcomes be comparable across different regions using the certificate approach? So I guess that relates to the above queries about certificates versus the biodiversity unit.
Yeah, but if you want me to jump in there, AB.
Yeah, I was just going to say, did you want to take that?
Yep, sure. I think because our intention is that the certificates will describe projects using a standardised set of attributes that would allow buyers to compare across projects that are available in the market, depending on what is the attributes that they're actually most interested in. For example, they might be particularly interested in investing in projects in particular regions, or investing in particularly large projects, or indeed projects that relate to a particular threatened species. So that type of information will be available in relation to projects. I think just coming back to the benefit assessment process, I think that's probably going to address some of the concerns that you might be raising, which is starting to provide that information to the market that could be sort of seen as like a credit or a unit type thing. So it's a sort of a score for a project which looks at the condition gain, but what the project also means in a regional or landscape context, whether that's a score or a set of information against particular categories of biodiversity outcome. There will be information available to the market that allows comparison across projects. What we didn't want to do was just provide a number, which then doesn't really allow buyers to look really at the things that they're interested in investing in, that we've heard from what is sort of going to be a voluntary market in the first instance, that there's a lot of different drivers for why people might be looking to buy biodiversity outcomes, and that using the attribute approach sort of facilitates as much of that as is possible.
I'm just going to jump in. Is the priority to target private, or has the government, the Commonwealth, got quite a heavy interest in purchasing?
So there's the legislation provides the opportunity for the government to purchase, but there is no, that's a decision for the government should they want to put money into that space. But so the current intent is to provide the sort of the framework that delivers on the standard way of measuring the outcomes, the property rights to the tradeable biodiversity certificate and the registry systems, which would then allow the private market to purchase these outcomes. It's fair to say that the initial expected interest is in the carbon plus biodiversity outcomes, that linkage of biodiversity co-benefits from carbon, which this would facilitate. When you're talking about the pure straight biodiversity outcomes, that market's probably not as advanced, but some of our consultation today indicated that if these kind of national legislation was in place that delivered the legal systems and the registry systems, etc., they expect that would grow, because they're looking for those kind of arrangements before they start buying or investing in this kind of space.
Absolutely. Thank you. So the next question, will there be technical guidelines to assist the development of additional protocols, or is this covered by Section 57?
Someone's read the legislation in detail. I'll have to check what Section 57 is, unless you've got that off the top of your head.
It's the integrity standards. So I guess the real rules around the development of protocols is set out in the legislation. There's prioritisation decisions that will need to be made by the government in terms of what protocols should be progressed in the first instance, but there wouldn't be technical guidelines in addition to the protocols. The committee will be developing and providing advice on the protocols, and then the minister would be making the protocol determinations. There might be guidance material that sits around that, which is for proponents around the development of their projects, etc. But I think you were asking about guidance to guide protocols, and that's actually the legislation itself.
Right, thank you. What fees and charges will be incurred by proponents for administration and verification of certificates? Or are we not really in a position to estimate those yet?
No, there's, in terms of participation in the scheme, so there's we're not suggesting it's a cost recovery exercise in terms of the government aspects. But in terms of other aspects in the market, no, we can't really, I suppose, comment on that. We did, there is a regulatory impact statement attached to the explanatory memorandum, which has done some initial kind of estimates of, I suppose, potential costs associated with it. But the net ambition is for this is to provide a financial return to landholders, which would deliver potential additional income to the current, I suppose, business practices.
Thanks, Anthony. So just following up to the question I asked earlier around the market, how does this relate to offset markets then, or is it just farmer to farmer?
So we're not, you go for that.
Okay, so I guess we're not really, we're not making any judgments in relation to this scheme and the offset market. So the operation of offset markets is a matter for other environmental regulators. So in the first instance, the focus of this market is voluntary buyers and those who'd be interested in purchasing a certificate. However, it's not to say that at some point in the future, an offsets regulator might decide that they would be willing to accept certificates out of this market as part of an offset arrangement, but that's not really a decision for us. That's a decision for Commonwealth and state regulatory decision makers.
Great, thank you. And then I think coming to our last one, there's just an addition to the question we asked earlier. How do you anticipate a market and pricing mechanism operating when certificates will be so heterogeneous as opposed to ACCUs?
You want to take that one, Heather?
Do you want to talk pricing? I think there's like no denying that it is a heterogeneous market. And that's sort of part of the reason why we have a certificate approach, which has the standard set of attributes, because different buyers have different reasons for buying. So they want to be able to look at projects on that basis. It will take time for the pricing to sort of develop. And I think there's work going on in the stewardship package, which is looking at some of the pricing aspects in terms of what's needed for a farmer to participate. But Anthony, you might have some.
Yeah, I was just going to just a couple of things. Yes, I suppose this is well, it's going to be a diverse market in terms of what their buyers may be after certain things and sellers may be able to sell certain things. But what's really been lacking to date is, I suppose, transparency in that market for people to value appropriately. And certainly when we've spoken to the NFF Sustainability Committee, that they're, I suppose, concerned about the ability for the landholder to know the value of these things before they start selling them. That's going to have to, I think, improve over time as the market develops and the depth in the market develops. And one of the, I suppose, ambitions of the trading platform is to provide more of that information to the market. And so in terms of our experience to date under the Ag Stewardship package, so we are currently trialling the Enhancing Remnant Vegetation pilots, which is the sort of the first attempt to price this into market just for pure biodiversity outcomes. And so we're testing that in terms of a market sense and hope to get information out on that once that round has been approved to start feeding that into the market. But I think it's fair to say, Will, it's early days at the moment, and that'll have to develop over time. But I think the intent behind the legislation is really to build the frameworks for and the legal frameworks for this market to develop over time.
I might just add something to that as well, which probably wasn't super clear in my presentation, is that whilst we're expecting the protocols will say something about minimum permanence periods for projects, because there's, in some cases there'll be an amount of time you have to run a project for it to be worth doing. But we're not looking at kind of locking in permanence arrangements in the way that exists for the carbon market. So there is more flexibility for the farmer there to offer up what they're kind of willing to commit to, and then the market can make its decision about the willingness to pay. But I think that means that people aren't necessarily signing up to 100-year permanence periods in the absence of sort of a fully developed market with a lot of pricing information. This will give us a bit more flexibility for people to take the step they're willing to take into the market and learn more along the way.
Absolutely. And I think NRM regional organisations really are best placed to act as that middleman, the communicator between department and people. And I also think with the emission reduction fund, with the carbon projects, a lot of people went into that initially blind. They went into that completely blinkered to what they were going into. So I think a priority for this is to make sure that there is that skill, there is that the capacity building, and people are fully aware of exactly what they're signing up for, how long for, and what their commitments and obligations and accountability is. So Chris has asked a question around timeframes, and I know you've said, Anthony and Heather, that it's very much just setting up the framework. It's very, very early days, but he's asked about the ideal timing, rolling the process out, and at what stage and what steps can the NRM sector actually have input into the design.
Heather, do you just want to run through your timeline?
Yeah, sure. Yep. Yeah, so once the legislation gets passed, the bill commences on royal assent, which is something that should happen relatively quickly. So that means the legislation would come into effect. However, the provisions that relate to someone submitting a project for registration, they don't start until the minister makes a declaration. So that recognises the fact that there is a body of work to be done between the legislation becoming live and our ability to accept project registrations. And there's not a specific timing on that in the legislation, but the intention is that that would be happening very quickly, and that we would hopefully be able to be accepting registration sort of within 12 months. So that's sort of the scenario that we're looking towards there. And as I kind of outlined in the presentation, that's the time at which the committee gets formally appointed, the early work on protocols occurs, and we get some protocol determinations in place. We have a benefit scoring approach settled so that type of information can be available for the first projects that get registered. And then after that, it's just sort of developing over time. Obviously, there's going to be some critical decisions around which protocols get developed first. And I think there's a question in the question box about, are other methodologies being developed? And that's something that we've yet to sort of settle on, and that will be something that we'll need to work through with the advisory committee. But at this stage, we have no protocol determinations. We have work under the ANU process, and there will be a bunch of work to kind of bring things into the scheme and have them developed such that they meet the requirements of a determination under the legislation. I don't know if you want to add something there, AB?
No, I think that's good.
Alrighty, Kate, I'm actually going to throw over to Kate. There's a few questions still to be asked, but I'm actually just going to throw it to Kate for the last 5 minutes to ask the last couple and then bring it to a bit of a wrap. So Kate Andrews, I'm going to throw you in just to wrap up with those last few that have come in.
Thanks, Emma, no problem. So we've just got a couple left, and one of them is about extension services. So Heather or Anthony, basically extension services are going to be critical for the successful delivery. And of course, the questioner is saying NRM regions are best placed to deliver these. I would expect them to say that. So has DAWE considered the necessary provisions to deliver these critical services?
Yes, and I think, again, I think reflecting on the success that we've used the NRM bodies as part of the Ag Stewardship pilot as that kind of voice on the ground has been proven really successful. And I think spot on extension services and advice on the ground will be essential for these markets to operate. So yes, we'll certainly be drawing on NRM group expertise, but we'll have to work through what that is specifically and how we work that through going forward. But yes, I think the NRM bodies across the country are doing an excellent job, and we see them as certainly our eyes and ears on the ground. And so looking forward to working with you guys more going forward.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Anthony. That's great. Okay, so we have another question, which I think probably goes back to you, Heather, and one of your first slides, which is when you say there's a diversity market or a market for this, who is it? What type of organisations and businesses have actually expressed interest in this market? So if you could describe it a bit more to us so that people can actually understand, I guess, who's out there in the private sector wanting to purchase.
You go, Heather.
Oh no, happy for you to jump in.
Yeah, happy to. So looking at it in two aspects. One, as I mentioned before, the carbon plus biodiversity aspect. Getting co-benefits from carbon projects on the land is growing rapidly. So anyone looking to purchase carbon outcomes in the landscape don't just want pure carbon outcomes, they want a biodiversity co-benefit attached to it. So think of your Woodsides, your banks, your Telstras, all those that are looking to purchase ACCUs. If they're coming from an agricultural environment, they don't want just an ACCU, they want an ACCU with a biodiversity co-benefit, and the intent that this can provide that biodiversity certificate attached to a carbon would certainly drive that demand. And I think if you're looking at the spot prices of ACCUs, they're continuing to go up, especially if you look at some of the independent reporting that with co-benefits, they're certainly going up, I think, considerably, and certainly over the last 12 months. When you're watching the ABC News and the financial report is including ACCU prices, I know that's when you've sort of embedded it in sort of financial reporting, so it's good to see that coming through. In terms of pure biodiversity outcomes, yes, that is less developed, but this is when, and we could probably have a separate session on this, but things are changing globally around markets, around financial markets. The establishment last year of the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, for instance, for those unaware around that, that was a bit similar to the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures, but the financial sector is moving away from just looking at carbon. They're looking at broader nature and biodiversity impacts, not just their risks or their impacts to nature, but also how dependent they are on aspects of nature within their business systems and financial systems. So Australia joined that at the COP last year, and we're working closely with the Secretariat on that. But it's just sort of a recognition that the organisations as part of that, and in Australia, I can rattle off who's involved in that: Minerals Council of Australia, Macquarie Bank, various other sort of financial institutions. We're all trying to figure out, okay, this is coming our way in terms of biodiversity and nature as part of their financial decision making. So I can't quantify the size of it, and I can't say Macquarie is going to go out tomorrow and buy these kind of things, but they're planning for this going forward, and it's moving very rapidly. So the beta version of the TNFD framework for reporting on financial disclosures from nature-related financial disclosures, they're expected to release that mid to late March, and that'll be sort of the first product coming out of that, which we'll be talking to stakeholders on. So yes, things are changing in that space, and they're effectively changing quite rapidly. But in terms of the size of it, I couldn't comment at the moment, but certainly your banks and financial institutions and other businesses that have an involvement in land sector that they're dependent on as part of their business are looking for these kind of outcomes going forward.
So Anthony, just as with the carbon market, managing integrity and supply over time is going to be crucial, and that's where ensuring that we get the public sector frameworks robust enough is going to be so fundamental. And that's that interesting coming together, isn't it, in that way, hence the work that you and Heather are doing, and the work that we do as regional NRMs. So yeah, okay, look, feels like we could have a session from you quite regularly, and there's so much to talk about in this space, but I'm going to hand back to Emma now. So apologies to people if we haven't managed to ask your question, but there were some great questions there, so thank you people, and I'll hand back to Emma.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you for jumping in. I threw the ball to Kate's court because there were a few there and I thought it would be good for Kate to sort of combine them and wrap them together. So Anthony and Heather, thank you so much for your time today. And thank you, I see Steve's hooked in too. So thank you, Steve, for hooking in. As we said, Heather and Anthony are very kindly going to share their presentation as a PDF. So Kate will make sure that's circulated afterwards. And I guess it's a wrap. Anthony, Heather, thank you so much. And thank you again for everyone who's hooked in, watch this space. And we wish your department all the best with this bill in March. It sounds very exciting, Anthony.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks for Kate for coordinating. And if there's any follow-up questions, if you're flicking through to Kate or Emma, then I'm happy to come back and provide the answers where we can.
Thanks very much. Thanks all.